Good morning. This is Phil Vickers coming to you with another short devotion. I'd like to read to you a passage from the book of Isaiah. This coming from chapter 6 of Isaiah, which is the record of the prophet's call story. It's interesting to look through the Old Testament and see that many of the prophets in their prophetic books have a story of how they were called into ministry. And it's interesting to look and see how their different contexts, their different origins play into what they had to say, play into what message they brought from God. And also to look at some of the hurdles and the obstacles that they overcame in this great transition from being what they were before to being a prophet called and sent by God. But from Isaiah 6, verse 1, it says, "In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. His train filled the sanctuary. Above him stood two seraphs, each one with 6 wings, 2 to cover its face, 2 to cover its feet, and 2 for flying. And they were shouting these words to each other, 'Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh Sabaoth. His glory fills the whole earth.'" That may sound a little different than you're used to hearing. I'm actually reading from a translation of the Bible called the New Jerusalem Bible, which is an excellent translation. I recommend it to you. And sometimes it's enlightening just to hear these passages translated in just a little different way, and it helps you to think about them differently. A couple of the things that jump out at you from that passage is the timing of this vision, the timing of this call story. It takes place in the year that King Uzziah died. For these ancient peoples, the king was a sign and a symbol of stability and order. A good king was supposed to bring plenty for his people, victory over enemies, all the things that lead to a good life. And so the death of a king was a major event. There would have been questions about who would succeed the king, how order would continue. And so for a king to die was a greatly upsetting, greatly life-shaking event. I think it's telling that God gives this vision to Isaiah in the year that King Uzziah died, because it's a reminder of where true authority comes from. The earthly powers may have been shaken, but the one who is in control of all things still reigns. That's a good reminder for us in these times when earthly powers seem shaken, when there seems to be a less of a trust in our governments and our government's ability to keep us safe, and in the future in general. There's so much anxiety, and so to remember where final authority rests is so important. It goes on to say that he was seated on this high throne and his train filled the temple, or another translation says that the hem of his robe filled the temple. In this time, the hem of one's robe was considered one of the least dignified parts of a person. Like we would think of the bottoms of one's shoes as dirty, so the train of a robe, the hem of a robe, would trail in the dust and therefore be less dignified than the cleaner parts of one's presence. And yet the fact that the train of God's robe fills the temple means that the least noble, least dignified part of God is still this amazing presence in the temple. It fills it up. So there is no lack of dignity with God. When it says seraphs, that's very interesting, because seraphs are often pictured in ancient art as looking very much like dragons. We hear that they have 6 wings. 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. So the point here is that even these majestic, powerful beings are humble in God's presence. It's another pointer, another reminder of the majesty, the oneness of God alone. That even these powerful, majestic creatures come to His presence with meekness. And they cry out to each other about His goodness. And it goes on to say, the doorpost shook at the sound of their shouting, and the temple was full of smoke. And I said, "Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh Sabaoth." Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding in its hand a live coal, which it had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. With this it touched my mouth and said, Look, this has touched your lips. Your guilt has been removed, your sin forgiven. I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. So there's this moment of purification. We think of fire as destructive, but we can also think of fire as purifying. We can see that like in the story of the coming of the Holy Spirit, where these flames descend upon the disciples, and it is as if they are purified and begin a new life in the power of the Holy Spirit. And here the same thing. We obviously wouldn't want to touch our lips or tongue to a live coal, but the image here is one of purification. What was before is gone, and the prophet is made ready to do God's will. We may not all receive visions from God. We may not all have ecstatic experiences. We may not all speak in tongues or receive visions or dream dreams like some of the stories we hear in the Bible. But what we're called to recognize is that through the Word we experience the same message. The reason these are recorded here is so that we experience them ourselves through faith. And so Isaiah's vision is ours as well. In a time when earthly powers and earthly events seem shaken up, God sits on God's throne and is in majestic control of all things. We place our faith in God, and we recognize that the sins of the past are covered up by God's grace, opening us up to futures which only He knows, but which we can look forward to with great hope and great expectation. As God sent Isaiah out, may God send us out to be reconcilers and peacemakers in this difficult time, and may we experience greatly the joy of the Lord in our lives. Thank you.